Thomas Harrell had 30 days to get married or lose the only thing his father had left him. But when a woman named Elaine Grayson stepped off the train and looked him in the eyes, Thomas had no idea that the marriage meant to save his ranch would eventually become the one thing he could never bear to lose. Before we begin this emotional Wild West love story, make sure you subscribe to Legend of West, because if you love powerful cowboy romances where two strangers slowly become everything to each other, you will not want to miss what happens next. In Caldwell Creek, people rarely spoke badly about Thomas Harrell. They simply spoke quietly about him. He was 31, owned 40 acres of stubborn Texas land, worked from sunrise until dark, and had not given the town a genuine smile in years. After his father's death, Thomas inherited the ranch, an aging house, and one condition hidden inside the old man's will. Thomas had to marry before his 32nd birthday, or the property would pass to his uncle Gerald, a man already waiting for the chance to sell it. Thomas had kept the matter secret, refusing pity from neighbors or sermons from the preacher. But with his birthday approaching, he finally wrote an advertisement for a wife. He kept it simple: rancher, 31, seeking a woman of honest character for marriage, practical arrangement, no false promises. He expected rejection. Instead, 4 women answered. 3 letters were dismissed quickly, but one stopped him completely. Her name was Elaine Grayson. She was 28, had worked as a school teacher in Millhaven for 4 years, and wrote with an honesty that surprised him. She wasn't asking to be rescued, and she wasn't pretending marriage would magically change her life. She simply understood what a practical marriage meant. Near the end of her letter, she wrote that hard work, harsh weather, and long silences did not frighten her because she had known all 3. Thomas read that sentence 3 times. He answered that same evening. His reply was brief, but he invited her to visit before making any decision and promised to pay her train fare whether she accepted him or walked away. Elaine noticed that detail. It told her he understood she deserved a choice. She arrived in Caldwell Creek on Friday afternoon. Thomas had reached the station early and spent the entire wait pretending he wasn't nervous. Then the train stopped, and Elaine stepped down carrying one travel bag. She wasn't dressed to impress anyone. She simply stood straight, looked around calmly, and walked toward him. "Mr. Harrell?" she asked. "Miss Grayson." Their handshake was firm. There was no instant romance, no dramatic smile, nothing that belonged in a fairy tale. Yet something about her quiet confidence unsettled the guarded rancher. During the ride to his property, Elaine asked practical questions about the land, the nearest school, the cattle, and the weather. Thomas answered honestly. When the ranch house finally appeared, Elaine studied the weathered porch and crooked shutters before saying, "It has good bones." Thomas wasn't sure why those 4 words stayed with him. That evening they discussed the marriage like 2 people negotiating a business agreement. They spoke about responsibilities, expectations, privacy, and the future. Everything was sensible, everything was controlled, until Elaine looked across the darkening porch and asked, "Thomas, why has no woman ever claimed your heart?" He went silent. The answer he gave was practical. The truth was much deeper, and Elaine could hear the difference. Elaine stayed at Thomas Harrell's ranch for 3 days before making her decision, and during those 3 days, something neither of them had planned began taking shape. It wasn't passion, it wasn't yet love. It was something quieter, the strange comfort of discovering another person understood the things you rarely explained. Elaine noticed the ranch needed work, but she never mocked what Thomas had struggled to maintain. Instead, she asked questions and offered practical ideas. On her second morning, she found the account ledger and asked permission to examine it. Thomas handed it over without hesitation. She quickly noticed that one feed supplier was charging him considerably more than another nearby merchant. "You're losing money here," she told him plainly. Thomas studied the figures and realized she was right. He had expected a wife who could share the burdens of ranch life. He hadn't expected someone who could see problems he'd grown too accustomed to. Noticing, "I'll fix it," he said. Elaine closed the ledger. "I know you will." Something about her confidence affected him more than praise ever could. Before she left, Thomas asked if she still wanted the arrangement. Elaine looked toward the fields and said she wasn't afraid of the work. She was only afraid of spending another decade living carefully without ever building something that belonged to her. Thomas understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. 3 weeks later, they married at the ranch. There was no grand ceremony. The preacher came to the house, and Dale Pearson and his wife Margaret stood as witnesses. Elaine wore a simple dress the color of dried earth after summer heat. Thomas wore his best shirt and had pressed it so carefully that Margaret teased him about the crease. The ceremony lasted only a few minutes. They promised what they had agreed to promise, but neither understood yet how those words would change their lives. Afterward, the town began talking. Some called it a mail-order marriage. Others assumed Elaine had married Thomas for the ranch. Elaine refused to defend herself. When she heard the gossip, she simply walked into the dry goods store, bought sewing supplies, spoke politely to the owner, and left without acknowledging a single rumor. Thomas heard. What happened? He said nothing, but pride quietly warmed his expression. What surprised him most wasn't that Elaine could manage the household. It was how quickly he began missing her whenever she wasn't nearby. He started noticing the sound of her footsteps in the morning. He looked forward to supper conversations. He listened when she read in the evenings. He began telling her things about his father, the ranch and the land that he had never told another person. Elaine never interrupted his silences with empty comfort. She simply listened. One evening, she admitted that she had spent years avoiding desires because wanting something made losing it more painful. Thomas looked across the table at her and said, "This place is yours too." Elaine lowered her eyes, but he saw the emotion. She tried to hide. From that night forward, the ranch began changing. Elaine planted a garden beside the house. She kept the accounts. She rode with Thomas to inspect fences and learned the land as though she had lived there for years. Thomas began coming home earlier whenever he could. One afternoon, he found her kneeling in the garden with dirt on her sleeves. She looked completely at home. He stood watching her, longer than he should have. When she finally noticed him, their eyes met. Neither spoke. But Thomas felt something inside him shift. That evening, he couldn't sleep. The marriage had been supposed to save his property, yet somewhere along the way, he had started fearing the thought of losing something far more valuable than land. And the most frightening part was that he didn't know whether Elaine felt the same. For 9 days, Thomas Harrell fought a battle no one in Caldwell Creek could see. He worked longer hours, repaired fences that could have waited, and found reasons to stay outside until darkness covered the ranch. He told himself he was simply being responsible. But every excuse was a lie. He was afraid to admit that Elaine had become the first person he wanted to see every morning and the last person he thought about before sleep. Elaine noticed the change, but she didn't pressure him. She continued tending her garden, managing the household, and riding beside him whenever the ranch required it. She never demanded affection from a man who had originally offered her only an arrangement. Somehow, that made his feelings even stronger. Then Margaret Pearson came to the ranch one afternoon carrying a jar of butter and a knowing smile. She spoke with Elaine in the kitchen while Thomas worked outside. After several minutes of ordinary conversation, Margaret finally said, "He's different since you came here." Elaine went quiet. "Different how?" she asked. Margaret smiled softly, like a man who remembered how to hope. Thomas heard enough to understand the conversation. It was about him. He drove a nail into the porch board harder than necessary and stared across the yard. When Margaret finally left, Elaine returned to the kitchen. Neither mentioned what had been said, but the silence between them had changed. That evening, Thomas washed the dishes while Elaine dried them. Their hands brushed once when they reached for the same plate. Neither pulled away immediately. "Elaine," Thomas finally said. She turned toward him. He had imagined this moment many times, but every speech sounded false when he tried to put it into words, so he chose honesty instead. "When you came here, I thought I was asking you to help me keep my father's land. I thought that was all I needed." Elaine watched him carefully. Thomas continued, "Then you became part of every ordinary thing I looked forward to." Her expression softened. "Thomas, I don't want this to be an arrangement anymore." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of everything he had been afraid to say. Elaine looked down for a moment. "And if I told you, I stopped thinking of it as an arrangement a long time ago." Thomas couldn't speak. She stepped closer. "I didn't come here because I needed rescuing," she whispered. "I came because I thought two people could build something practical together. Somewhere along the way, you became the home I wasn't expecting." Thomas reached for her hand. There was no grand declaration, no audience, no perfect moment prepared for them. Just two people standing in a small ranch kitchen, realizing that the marriage they had entered for practical reasons had become the most genuine thing either had ever known. Thomas smiled then, a real smile, the kind Caldwell Creek had not seen in years. Elaine laughed softly when she saw it, and suddenly the old house didn't feel like a burden left behind by a dead father. It felt like the beginning of their life. The will had demanded that Thomas find a wife before his birthday. It had never demanded that he love her. But life had given him something the old document could never have predicted. The woman who arrived as a stranger had become his partner, his peace, and the one person he could not imagine losing. Their marriage had started as an arrangement. But by the time they stood together beneath the fading Texas sunset, neither of them cared what had brought them together. What mattered was what they had chosen to become, and this time they chose each other.